Yeah, so the truth about brand boycotts, so we're going to talk about the current Bud Light situation and talk about why this is, in our view, not a boycott. It's something much worse than that. And we'll kind of tell you how Frank and I came to that conclusion based on the brand investment and valuation model that we put together a few years back. First of all, I'm only going to introduce this Bud Light scenario very briefly because you're all probably somewhat familiar with it. Back in very early April, an influencer, Dylan Mulvaney, posted a Bud Light promotional video, let's call it that, on Instagram, which created quite a stir thereafter. I'll leave it at that. You've all, sort of tracked probably what happened. We wrote about this, Frank and I collaborated on a piece that we put on the MASB site originally on May 10th, which was about just over a month or so into this whole episode. And then we just released a follow-up 2 weeks ago, on July 26th, sort of reiterating our position. And so let's talk about our belief of whether this is a boycott or not. And conveniently, if we go to the Universal Marketing Dictionary, there's a definition for boycott. And so I'll read it. It's only 2 sentences long. A boycott in the marketing context is a form of protest where a group of customers collectively refuse to use or buy products from a certain brand or company. The second sentence is kind of the key. Boycotts may be launched by an organization which issues demands to be met by the company with a boycott to be ended. So this is where we really believe this situation fails to be a boycott. Interestingly, in the follow-ups to AB InBev's quarterly release last week, I read 2 Wall Street Journal articles, there may have been more, that referred to this as a boycott. My challenge there is, if this is a boycott, answer me this question. Who wants what by when? That cannot be answered in this case. And that's why we would call this classic example of a brand divorce, which I've suggested to Frank and Eric. We don't have a definition for brand divorce in the Universal Marketing Dictionary. We need to add it. I'll get into a bit of the background here. I want to take you about 5 minutes in, and then I'll pause for some comments. This is what happened. So this is, these are weekly dollar sales volume percentage changes year on year. This source here is Nielsen. This is on-premise, or this is off-premise only. It's about 80% of the industry, and it's tracked quite accurately. So you can see coming into this episode, Bud Light has been slightly down as a brand for many years. Generally, it's been trading off volume, kind of in the Anheuser-Busch house with Michelob Ultra, which they're perfectly happy to have happen. So you're starting with kind of a baseline of down, low single-digit percentage points, and very quickly going to down 26%, an average that we computed across, I think, the last 7 weeks. And it's sticking there. 2 things actually make this worse. During much of this period, because of what was going on, across much of the country, Bud Light offered $15 per case rebates. This would be on 20, 24, and 30 packs. Since that flows through a separate rebate redemption stream, it would not be in these numbers. That would make these dollar sales volume declines worse. Secondly, year on year, the beer industry experienced price increases somewhere in the mid-single digit range. So if you wanted just to do an absolute volume percentage decline, it's probably closer to 31% rather than 26%. So this has not been a pleasant scenario for Bud Light. I'm going to then talk to our brand investment and valuation model. I'm initially just going to cover the three either boxes or circles on the far left. I'll pause them and we'll kind of move across after that. So
yes, it's market.
The central item in all of this is brand preference, and MASB did some work back in 2016 that established brand preference as kind of the holy grail of brand success. And there's a lot of, we've published that work on our site. You can go out and see it. We won't get into that aspect here. The key thing relative to this brand investment model for the Bud Light situation is that there are two things that feed into brand preference. On the top side, external activities, and at the bottom, brand activities. So in this particular case, the brand activity initially was the Dylan Mulvaney Instagram post. There's two things we'd probably really emphasize in this situation that are really important. First of all, every marketing activity affects brand preference. Bud Light does tentpole type marketing work in terms of Super Bowl ads, but what this situation shows is that what some may have thought was a relatively minor marketing activity had a huge impact. Secondly, I would broaden out the word marketing relative to this model. I think it always includes things like sales activation. In this case, it would also include public relations, corporate communications. In this case, it also included executive quotes, which were quite damaging in their entirety. They were trying to improve the situation with the best of intentions. That's not how it worked. On the top side, you've got external activities. Now, while the brand activities, you would say, is pretty much 100% under control by the marketers, the external activities is the real problem because it's largely entirely out of the marketer's control. And so in this case, the Dylan Mulvaney post was followed by a lot of negative social media activity. And the reality is it included politically right-leaning interests, politically left-leaning interests, and I would say totally politically agnostic. But it was not good. And they really did not have any control over it whatsoever. External activities also includes competitors. So a tiny little brewery called Yingling, oldest brewery, I believe, continuously operating brewery in the country, I believe. It's headquartered in Pennsylvania. A couple years back, they introduced a low-calorie option called Yingling Flight. And they were very lucky in early May because they came out with packaging. It was kind of red, white, and blue. It tugged on the patriotic heartstrings. Knowing in the beer industry when packaging changes have to start, this was probably planned well in advance. It had to be, of this particular situation. And they just landed in a situation where people were walking away from Bud Light, and Yingling Flight was sitting there as an interesting alternative. That said, it's Miller Lite and Coors Light that really have benefited the greatest from this. And another external activity we found out about last week, in the Molson Coors earnings call, they stated in the back half of the year they were adding $100 million to marketing. And they said it was predominantly in the US. I would guess it's almost entirely in the US on Coors Light and Miller Lite. So with that, I'm going to go through the rest of this, but I just want to pause for any comments or questions that you might have. Yeah.
I think your earlier statement about brand divorce, I think, is really critical, because
It's a great term.
what people I find frequently kind of get in their goldfish bowl is they don't take a look at what their consumer or customer's ecosystem is and what their options are.
Yeah.
And they're just going and looking at just kind of maintaining the same numbers, keeping the same trajectory, getting to spreadsheet forecasting, and knowing what is called first, second, third alternative is very critical. I mentioned the United example yesterday. I got access to data that went and showed that the impairment for United, their experience of brand divorce was not that the people who were flying with United as their primary carrier was lost. They lost the people that had United as their first alternative, and it became the last alternative. And that was how brand divorce manifested for them. So the option value for United declined dramatically, and that reflected in the fact that they started having lower capacity, less last-minute ticket purchases.
And the brand divorce definition is something akin to, it's really a non-temporary change in brand preference.
Yeah, multi-year.
A boycott is, we still like you, but you got to do this by this time. That's not what this is.
I think the example in something like this is critical, because when Nike was getting its boycotts years ago, right, people came back to the brand after they went and corrected for it. But as you went and said here, right, like, what's the boycott about? Like, they want to consume this thing, and clearly the answer doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah, and unfortunately for them, in this case, you have readily available substitutes. That are not, that, you know, and
that's a really good
now,
point.
the brand folks would argue these are very differentiated. Well, the flavor profiles of the beers I've named to this point, Bud Light, Coors Light, Miller Lite, Yuengling Light, are quite similar.
Yeah, I do think on the point of, while we talk about preference, and with a traditional boycott, it is people who prefer your brand who are withholding purchases, but they still prefer you.
Right.
In this case, with the brand divorce, is those are when people break away that preference and move their preference to other brands. But there is some information coming out more recently, more deep dive, that are putting this even one step further, where it's not just that the preferred brand is no longer that option, but that they're actually removing them completely from the consideration set. So you go to a bar and they'll say something like, you know, you'll say, hey, can I get a Coors Light? And they'll say, no, but we have Bud Light. And normally what would happen is like, okay, now there's suggestion that they're saying no. So you know the standard Coke and Pepsi.
Right.
So, hey, can I get a Coke? And it's like, oh, we don't have Coke, we have Pepsi products. Will Pepsi work? Sure. All right. In this case, it's like, no, that won't work. So some of the, especially the on-premise data, is suggesting that this has even moved beyond the preferred brand into the elimination of the brand from the consideration set, which is extraordinary.
And there was evidence of this actually quite early on, which caused us to write, you know, our May piece. It's like, this is just fundamentally being misunderstood. This is not a traditional.
Well, you know what's interesting about
all.
this is that it really puts something like the Audi unintended acceleration thing into a different perspective, right? So they ultimately exited the U.S. market, right, because they didn't like all the controversy around their problems, and they locked in what was probably a boycott, more of a boycott situation, into something far more permanent by essentially preemptively divorcing the population from their products, right? And lost all that revenue for 20 years before they re-entered the U.S. market, right? It's a different twist on this, right? But it really illustrates the fact that you can lock this in, right? If all of a sudden Budweiser did something.
Let me keep going to the, I'm sorry, go ahead, and then I'll, yeah.
I think when this thing originally broke, the three things that surprised me was how many folks were looking at this lens of, well, it's just another crisis communications issue, it'll blow over. And
And I think that's supported by some of the executive quotes.
Oh, yeah.
but you could almost see that the counsel they were getting was, it's just a crisis communications issue, we'll package this, we'll get over this, it's gonna blow over, and it's like, no. And I think the other thing that was discerning was, well, we'll make it up on our other brands.
Yeah, and it's actually been a bit of the opposite, because
And
there's
it's
social
like,
media traffic now out there that says, oh, by the way, do you know the folks who make Bud
Exactly.
Light also make,
You may not have had that linkage before, but now you've got this multiplier effect.
Yeah. So now, I'm sorry, I think
I
Neil, you had a
think one
comment
of the
as
things
well.
that's interesting
Yeah.
is I see this, obviously there was some executed issues,
Yeah.
but I see the impact of politics more interesting, going broader. And I see this happening again and again because, Bud's this kind of mainstream type company. It kind of needs to get everyone on board, sort of. Whereas Yuengling, came out for Trump in 2016. It's a Trump company, and because it's more sort of niche, it can be niche. You know what I mean? It doesn't need to appeal to everyone. It can kind of say, hey, that's what we are. Whereas Bud's trying to be, hey, with this, with that, the other, everything. So I kind of see it happening more and more. I worry about, I should say I worry because I don't really care that much. But if Bud Light, Bud Light ceased to exist, I would.
But the scenario is a potential to repeat again.
Yeah, because these big companies that that kind of want to have a political presence, but they kind of don't. Are always going to be beaten by a company that's just like, this is our politics, we do it. Don't like us, that's fine with us.
I'm going to walk across here and I'll get to you, but this is starting to get really entrenched. So the news doesn't get better, it gets worse as you go through this model. So the big arrow there from brand preference goes to market share. And so in AB InBev's quarterly release last week, and I think it was actually in the analyst Q&A, where in their prepared remarks, where they stated that U.S. market share for AB InBev, so that is inclusive of Bud Light, Budweiser, Michelob Ultra, etc., in the quarter dropped from 42.1% to 36.9%.
What's the point of share worth?
5.2. So I've done the math. If that were to annualize, it's between $500 million and $1 billion, and I would contend it's closer to $1 billion.
Jeez.
Now AB InBev's a big company. It's not good news, but they are big enough that kind of flies under the radar screen. If this was the old Anheuser-Busch of old, strictly based in the U.S., this would be absolutely devastating. But it's still not a pretty picture by any means. So that's market share. Price premium, I mentioned the $15 a case rebates. I think we can move along from that one. This is actually the polar opposite of price premium as it's working out. And part of the issue with the rebates was their velocity was really the initial hammer here. Cases stopped moving off the retail shelves. Kegs started sitting, looking awfully lonely. And beer has a shelf life in the domestic markets, typically 90 days. for kegs, 120 days for cans and bottles. So velocity took a big hit. They needed, among other things, to clear some of that product through the shelves. And so you can see how this thing all started. This model kind of just feeds upon itself. So now the drop in velocity is starting to affect distribution. So we got a couple signals on this from Molson Coors in their earnings discussion. So they mentioned that during the second quarter, they had gained 12,000 tap handles in the US. And I was very surprised when the CEO, he kind of didn't want to say it, but he said, that's about a 10% order of magnitude. That is really, really significant in the beer business. He also mentioned that many retailers had already reached out. These would be typically grocers, grocery chains, had reached out to reset their shelf space in fall. And in the beer business, you do your major reset in spring, and then sometimes you do it in fall. But that tells us now, and we also saw examples in some of the media coverage of Costco. I'm not a Costco shopper. I'm a single guy who lives in the city. But I understand there's the so-called Costco Death Star that they put on. That is starting to appear on Bud Light. My guess is it's in stores where they may carry 4 different SKUs, and they're probably pulling 1 or 2 of them. But nonetheless, it's significant. And initially all this volume loss was velocity driven. Now it will also be distribution driven. Obviously, there are clear impacts to margin and operating cash flow. I sort of gave you the dollar magnitude of that. The 2 other ones I'll cover really quick. Category volume. So the question was posed to the Molson Coors CEO, have you seen this situation have an impact on category volume? Because category volumes have been somewhat weak in U.S. beer. And I think we all know when the market share leader has success or failure can sometimes carry over at the category level. He believed not and gave fairly good reasons for it, but I would say that's a yellow flag for the industry still. Time will tell. And then you have this optionality box. Easiest way to think of that in this context is you take the Bud Light trademark, and they've used it for Bud Light Lime, they've used it for Bud Light Hard Seltzer. I think those days are over for a while, and they may be over forever. So they have lost their optionality. Obviously, this is going to lead to a financial value of brand hit. And there's one box to the right here. Can anybody guess what that might be? It is enterprise value. And here's what that did. So the center line is the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which we chose that as our benchmark in this case, from April through a couple weeks ago. So sort of flat line-ish. The top one is Molson Coors, the bottom one is AB InBev. I doubt that this is coincidental.
So if you were to hold, this is obviously built-in assumptions, okay? But if you were to hold everything constant, what do you think we've learned from this and other things in the past in terms of how long it would take them to recover?
I would suggest that let's go back to the right side of this. If you believe in this model, Frank and I do, the only way out of this, in our view, is that brand preference has to change back in a significant positive direction And that only happens if both external activities and brand activities start working significantly in their favor. I think the probabilities of that are near zero.
Near zero, like pretty much all the way out, or near zero for 5 years, or?
For years, not weeks or months.
Right.
Now, as we point out in our article, one leverage point for Bud Light is they built up favorable brand preference for decades. And that could be a leverage point for them. But this isn't just going to fall out of the sky. They're going to have both work strongly in their favor.
And we all took a hit on this. To your point yesterday about the anger marketers, when they were named Marketer of the Year at Cannes.
Yeah, Larry mentioned Cannes earlier, and these guys are off collecting their award.
We all took a hit on that.
Oh, we absolutely did.
We took a huge hit on
Yeah.
it. So it's not just shame on them, it's like,
That's the net, I mean, you could say, I think, that a KPI on this, right, is the extent of meme activity,
Exactly. Yeah.
right? When there's a lot of highly derogatory
So read,
jokes.
click into some of the links in our article. There was a lot of stuff we could not put in there, but it's in the links.
So when you've got CEOs and CFOs going, yeah, okay, so was this going to put me into the Bud Light category, right? If we do whatever is being proposed,
Yeah.
right? That's what you're talking
we
about.
all took a hit.
Yeah, we all
Mhm.
did.
But what this is
Yeah.
also saying, it was a weak, the brand was actually weak because it wasn't differentiated. The loyalty was strong, easily available substitutes, kind of like waiting.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
there
so
was-
it
but
was,
there's still
you could argue it was
marketers,
white,
that's
right,
not-
for,
It
you
was
know.
right, it was right,
But-
whereas, you know, the comparison with Nike is very cool because Nike has passionate loyalists and is differentiated, and Bud Light wasn't.
Well, I would disagree with that. They have very passionate consumers.
So,
Yeah.
just one quick
But
question.
I would argue less so than Nike. I agree,
Yeah.
way less so than Nike.
One quick question from a kind of like a knock-on perspective. I mean, I think I already know what everyone's going to say, but I'd like to assume. What does this do for the employability of the marketing manager that ran this whole thing, and how does that person come back? Or does that person come back?
Well, so 2 individuals have been placed on leave.
Right.
Yeah, whatever that means.
But I mean, do you feel like it's almost like permanently tarred with this, right? Like you're a mass murderer and
I don't have enough expertise to opine on that. That's not my area of expertise. I think it's possible, frankly, and I'm not sure their CEO handled it well.
Yeah.
But again, you know, I mean, that's my opinion.
Yeah, part of the issue after the event occurred was the formal communications from Anheuser-Busch, so the AB portion of AB InBev, there were two very distinct things that came from the CEO and from other that were repeated across all of management, so it was clear messaging. One was, it doesn't matter because we're so big, it doesn't matter what you consumers think. They literally said this is going to be less than 1% of overall AB InBev, and so don't worry about it, and so on. Clearly a communication to the investor side,
Right.
but boy, social media, the memes
Yeah, absolutely.
came.
This would suggest it
through.
matters.
Yeah, and so there was that aspect, and then the other communication that came through was on the individuals, where it was a leave of absence rather than a firing, and on the leave of absence side, there was quite a few reports being that the individuals were still on staff, and AB InBev today still says that they're still on staff.
It was not pretty, and yeah, I don't want to get into the soap opera side of this, but it was not, all of this was not very helpful. And then I think more recently, probably within the last month, you know, the CEO has almost made these appeals that, well, we're having to lay off our workers, and it's kind of the woe is us. I don't think that's among the strong brand activities
No,
that are going to bring this thing back.
right.
Yeah, so we don't really have the clarity on the inside of all the decision-making process, but there is one other very interesting story, I think, for us, which is that the system by which was used to decide upon this campaign. And so part of it was, in social media terms, a lot of these optimization engines for finding fits for brands are based purely upon the number of followers of an individual. But what people don't, what these systems don't recognize is that not all followers are advocates for that personality. And so in some cases, you can have 50% or more individuals who are actually detractors. And then so on your social media side, when you said about the meme thing comes up, that's one reason why this couldn't be tampered out, is because such a large portion of individuals who are actual followers were actually not advocates. You know, they weren't fans. And so I think that's one great takeaway that the brands are now looking at. It's like, okay, if we're going to do these type of relationships, we have to understand for each individual, how are they viewed by the people who are following. So if you're telling me 10 million people, is that 10 million fans, or is that 5 million fans and 5 million detractors? And so I think that's a part of management that we, as an industry, haven't quite got around yet. But I think that definitely would help on the meme side, as you put it.
So one of the things that we did some work for United Airlines during the whole doo-wah, and the elasticity or inelasticity of demand, right, played a huge role in blunting that whole thing for them. Because even in the middle of the storm, their revenues went up and their stock prices went up. And it was largely because people who might have really been pissed at them still said, they're still the only airline that will get me from A to B at the time that I need to go. And so I'm just going to do it, right?
Well, we all hate airlines anyhow, so and we all just fly them anyhow. So in fact, we hate them slightly more.
Fly 'em either
Maybe
way.
a little different.
But what was interesting was to see how a lot of C-suites saw that, understood that, and took away the wrong lesson. Because they took it out of the elasticity of demand context. I'm just wondering aloud, actually, whether that influenced, I don't know, but it might have influenced the Bud Light, right, the AB response to some degree. Because it would account for that kind of cavalier announcement.
Yeah, and to be fair, I think on AB's side, that is what a preponderance of the experts were telling them. So I think we should re-emphasize that when you read...
Yeah, when we wrote our article on May 10th, we were a big outlier. Because everybody was right, this is going to come and go. We can list out dozens of articles where people said, don't worry.
Yeah.
Wow.
Not it. And by the way, if you think this enterprise value chart is ugly, let me tell you a knock-on effect here. Larry, we were kind of chatting about this last night. So brewers sell through independent distributors. We talked last night, because Larry has roots in Indiana, about a company called Monarch Distributing. They are the independent distributors in most of the state of Indiana. There's only two Miller Coors beer distributors left, I believe, in Indiana. Monarch probably services 80% of the state. Is that about?
I would say
But based on what you know. Monarch Distributing distributes Coors Light, Miller Lite, Yingling Light, and Modelo, which, as you may have read, has now taken the
Right.
#1 sales spot.
Right.
Imagine what has happened to their enterprise value in the last 4 months. And oh, the poor neighboring Budweiser distributors. All of the volume is shifting away from them. And it happened very quickly.
So are we also saying that a category has a finite reservoir that is, well, that wouldn't be necessarily true, but in this case, right, that it just got reapportioned?
Yeah, up to this point, I think you would say easily 90+% of the volume has simply shifted. It's debatable whether they're, again, I wasn't following this closely enough, but it popped up in the conversations last week that the beer industry volumes have been a little bit softer than what people generally expected. It was clearly a little softer than what the analysts expected. But there could be, there could be broad economic reasons for that. It could be very temporary. But I think it's very safe to say 90+%, probably closer to 95+%. There's just been a reallocation. Yeah.
I think that's
I
it.
think that's it.
All right.
But we were very happy to see that this model explained a lot.